Okay, who's got the topic update volume AZ after service restart when the volume backend AZ was changed? So, okay, so that looks like a new spec. So, need to mute. That noise in the background is my dog, not me.
Uh, Not sure that this can be safely done. I could be wrong, but if I remember correctly, a service, when the service starts and looks into a services table, to know which entry corresponds to itself, the availability zone is one of the things that it checks. Because you can have, I think we check the availability the zone. If we do, then we cannot do this. But let me just have a quick look and see if we do the filtering based on that as well, in case I'm mistaken.
I think the bigger question, this spec seems to be going after I want to be able to change the availability zone for a service and then have certain things happen to make everything like it's supposed to be after that. So the first question is, should we even support the ability to change the AZ of a service that currently owns volumes? I mean, is that a sensible thing that we want to do to start with? It doesn't really spell out the use case other than I want to do this. I'm not sure what the actual use case is.
Is the use case that they're going to move the entire backend to another availability zone, so every volume in that backend would need to be updated?
Yeah.
That's what it sounds like.
Yeah.
That's a pretty tall task to just simply move an entire backend.
And that's the opening statement in the problem description.
Okay, I was mistaken, and we are not filtering by availability zone. So this is something that can actually be done.
But should it be done?
I think there is a use case for this. I'm not sure. In general, I'm against Cinder doing things automatically. I'm more inclined to say, if you change your availability zone, go to Cinder Manage and run this thing. Same thing we do when you change your backend name. It's like, yep, we have a tool in Cinder Manage to change the database. But
Yeah, I agree with that. Because at the time you're going to do this, you know exactly what you want to do, and you're not going to do it again. So let's just do it and get it over with. And if we
and you do it wrong, it's your fault.
Yeah, right.
Because I'm always scared of trying to be too smart in Cinder and shooting ourselves in the foot.
Yeah. Yeah, so when they're talking user here, they mean user as operator, not end user in any way. So it makes sense to push this to Cinder Manage. Yeah. All right, I'll leave comments to that effect on there. Anyone else who wants to, feel free also. Let me just do that real fast one. Okay, any other comments? All right, and thanks someone for taking notes there. Okay, I just put a link at the very bottom of the Etherpad. We can start mid-cycle planning. We've already talked about a couple of topics that we're going to want to revisit. So feel free to go to the Etherpad and start putting stuff there so we don't forget when that time comes around. So the plan, just to remind you, is we'll do one at R-18 and R-9. Pretty much our usual schedule. Okay, next up is the OpenStack client, not supporting Cinder Microversions. Whose topic was that?
That was me. I threw that in there.
Oh, Walt, okay.
Yeah, I ran into that recently when we upgraded to train. Our resource filters had the catch-all name tilde in there and did not have name because there's no reason to have both. If you have the name tilde, it should work for all of them. And we ran into that failing after we upgraded to train because train release removed a deprecated patch that's been around forever that was related to filtering based upon keys, because there was the generic filtering that was added at some point ages ago. And one of our customers ran into it because they were trying to do filtering based upon using the OpenStack client. And since that feature went away and wasn't there by default, and the OpenStack client does not send microversions. It does support microversions, it just doesn't send any for Cinder, so in effect it doesn't support it at all. They ran into this problem where all of a sudden their API went back to 3.0 from what it was. And so I don't know what we can do about this. I guess we are correct in removing deprecated APIs. The problem is that really only works when clients support microversions that allows the updated code to actually work. So this is kind of a breakage, but it's kind of an expected breakage, but it affects customers for us that aren't using the Cinder client, that are using the OpenStack client. And so I guess I just wanted to raise some visibility into this specific problem. I don't know what we can do about it other than getting my managers to allow us to spend time dedicating to adding microversion support to OpenStack client, which hasn't happened to this point, so I don't expect it will, but
I think it's possible to add in Eric, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you mentioned, or Alan, it was you maybe. You can add a specific microversion to the OpenStack in your part so that, for example, I think we have one microversion support with a specific feature added to the OpenStack client for Cinder. So this one could be added as well so that it supports the microversion your customer is having trouble with. So instead of having to do 2 months work adding microversion for everything, support for everything, you just need to add the microversion that allows the customer to do the filtering they want.
yeah.
And that should be a smallish patch.
We worked around it by adding the name filtering back in as well as the name tilde. So we got around that problem that way. But I guess just in general, the fact that we have customers using the OpenStack client talking to Cinder, and this is I don't know if there's any other deprecated APIs that we plan on removing, but this is a potential that customers might run into that, whatever that issue is in the future with respect to this too. And with my only question about that specific targeted microversion is that my assumption is if you say I want this particular version, that you're willing to support every version prior to that, the 3.0 as well, and not just that specific version. If you're saying that I support 3.50, then you support 3.0 to 350?
No, yeah, I can provide kind of a general update. This has been a constant rock in my shoe as well, Walt.
Okay.
And I've made a couple of, not quite aborted, but failed attempts to do some skunkworks testing about, what can we do to resolve the problem? The most recent effort taught me a lot about how I think the OpenStack client likes to treat microversions. And what I've learned is that indeed you specifically opt in for every individual microversion. It just wants to know whether or not you support a particular microversion. It's sort of odd behavior, but based on what I've learned, I'm now hoping that I can spend more time basically teaching it how to deal with many more microversions than it currently supports. I guess that's all I can say right now. Definitely feel your pain. Hoping to spend some time on it myself next cycle. But there actually is a provision for you to say, oh yes, we do support 3.34. Now it's a bit awkward because you'd like to think that if your client is set up with a default microversion of 3.35, that you'd get 3.34 for free. It doesn't work that way, but perhaps a stopgap workaround is if we taught the OpenStack client about 3.34, then your users simply would need to know that if they do want to run this filter query, they just need to do so with 3.34.
I see. So my understanding of microversions is incorrect in the respect that if you say I'm asking for a 3.34, you get everything between 3.0, which is our minimum, I think, and 3.4.
No, you're correct.
Right.
That Cinder in Cinder client behave that way, and that is what's expected. It's the OpenStack client,
right,
the one that is weird. So
yeah, it's definitely
what
an
you think
OpenStack
is correct.
That's even worse.
Yep.
Okay, ouch. That's bad. All right. Good to know.
Also, just a note, because I jumped yesterday into the meeting, the only 2 hours that were allocated for the OSC or OpenStack client, OpenStack SDK project. So there are two possible efforts in this direction. One is to fix the support for what we have right now in the OpenStack client as it is, with support for specific microversion. But there is also work ongoing into more long term, and the idea is to really add all the supported features in the OpenStack SDK at some point, but that's really for the future. But I still want to update about that.
Yeah, there
The
are
idea will be
orthogonal
to switch to
concepts,
that.
though.
Mm-hmm.
Just because the OpenSDK supports the microversions doesn't mean the OpenStack client does.
Yeah.
Right. But anyway, just wanted to say that there are a few students from, I don't remember the university, but if you check the notes from the OSC, SDK slot from yesterday, they are working right now in adding several missing feature on the SDK side. I don't think they are working also on the OpenStack client side. There were some maybes, but their specific work is going to end. They have a final term for that. So, but I think Kendall from the foundation knows more about that, but I haven't had time to ask more details about that. Manila was kind of successful in like offloading some of this work to outreach programs and students who improve the support. So, yeah.
Yeah, I learned quite a bit from speaking to one of my colleagues who's in Manila, the PTL, Gotham.
I guess now that I think about it, one of the side effects of the OpenStack client being the way that it is, that if you ask for a 3.55, you're really only saying that I only support this one, is that we should be able to add some of these microversion features into the OpenStack client a little bit easier. Pick the low-hanging fruit first.
That's my hope.
And work towards that, because I think from my perspective as someone who has to support customers that are calling APIs into Cinder, the OpenStack client is becoming increasingly more and more important to support the Cinder APIs that Cinder has defined, especially as I upgrade, because we're only running on Train now, and that's close to being already end of life, even though we just upgraded to it. So, I'm going to get more and more pressure to upgrade, and with that becomes more and more pressure to support the new APIs too, which means OpenStack client. But I'm not sure anybody from the OSC can actually add the Cinder specific support for each of those microversions, because they don't know the internals of what Cinder is supposed to do with each of those.
Well, right, and to that end, I think that it is the Cinder team's, I don't know, we're the ones motivated to do the work, and so we're probably the ones that should do the work. The only other thing that I want to mention that might facilitate this, but we would need buy-in from the OpenStack client folks, is there are a couple of other projects, Ironic and Manila come to mind, where they basically have the code living in their tree, and they provide support to the OpenStack client via the OpenStack client's own plugin framework. So we might be able to basically rip the code out of their hands, put it into Python Cinder client, implementing a OpenStack client plugin, but we're a little bit more in control of our own destiny now.
But on the other hand, if it's just a matter of having +2 in the OSC repository, I mean, it's probably just easier to start contributing and being promoted to core there and get because
if it worked out, sure. I've had problems in the past.
I kind of like the idea of pulling it into Cinder. If we had more and more resources and time, that way we would have one place to maintain the client access to the Cinder APIs instead of what we have now, which is 2, and one is paying the price of not supporting a lot of our APIs with respect to OSC versus the Cinder client. But that would require a lot of refactoring in the Cinder client to use the same plugin exports that we would give to OSC, so that way we're not maintaining two trees within the Cinder client too. That it would have to be done right, but we don't even have the resources to add stuff to the OSC, let alone refactor the Cinder client.
In order to get to a point, because we've been fighting this fight for a very long time, so should we require any microversion in Cinder to have not only code in the Cinder client, but in OSC as well? Because otherwise the distance is never going to increase. We keep adding features, we only add them to Cinder client. Because I just wrote a patch to add a microversion to Cinder, and I added the Cinder client, but of course I ignore the OpenStack client. Yeah. So should we, during reviews, make sure that we get that we have both patches? Maybe they don't get. It's not necessary for them to get merged, but they have to be present before we merge the microversion and Cinder.
Yeah, that's probably a good first step. At least have a patch in OSC up, whether it's passing or going to get merged or it's an ongoing, before we allow our stuff to merge, I think makes sense. I would vote for that.
Okay.
I'd also like to point out that the upstream meeting for the OSC SDK project has restarted after a long while, even though they are just one every month. So that could be a good idea to talk with the current team, which may not be. I don't think it's exactly the same as the team which some of you discussed a few years back. So, I mean, it could be a good idea to pop up there from time to time.
So if I understand correctly, if I added, for example, in my case, a microversion to Cinder, so when you ask for a volume with that microversion, you get a use quota field back, which is new, and shows whether the resource is temporary or not, and whether Cinder is accounting for quota there. And I added code to the Cinder client. Should I add code to OSC and the SDK, or just the OSC, or how does this thing work?
My understanding is that for now we are not using SDK in the OpenStack client. So, but that's a good question to ask them, because so far I didn't get whether the transition to the SDK is something that must be done at once, or it's something that could be done in parallel, like keeping some of the features with the current code and starting a new feature which uses the SDK directly in the client. So that could be a question for them. I really don't know.
Yeah, what I've heard is that they would really like everybody to be using the SDK. Well, that's great. They would like to use the SDK. You can't switch the OpenStack client to use the SDK until the SDK supports the underlying features. The SDK is sort of lagging behind our own Cinder client. So I appreciate their long-term goal. How we get there remains to be seen. I think my understanding, though, is even Nova, who I think is most heavily invested in the SDK, the OpenStack client is still using Nova client because the SDK just isn't there yet.
I'm kind of concerned that, for example, in this case, I add the code to the Cinder client, then I add it to OSC, and in a couple thousand years, we move to the SDK, and then we don't have any of the features that we have added to OSC. And we come back to the same problem that we have right now, which is feature disparity between two different code bases. So I don't know if we should add right now the feature, for example, for new stuff, not for the one that we already have, but for the new one, should it be added to SDK or the OSC? Because if I add it to the OSC and we are going to move to the SDK, I am doing work that it's going to only to be useful for a little bit, and then we are going to have to redo it again on the SDK.
Well, I think that OSC sort of lives on top of either SDK or Cinder client.
Mm-hmm.
And so regardless of where the underlying client-side code is added, you still likely have to add support in OSC. So I think in theory, everybody can laugh, the idea basically is that we would be putting code into the OpenStack client, and when a couple thousand years go by, Gorka, you can swap out the Cinder client for the SDK, and it poof magically works.
Okay, that makes it better, because in that case, just what I suggested earlier makes sense, which is you have to add it to both places, OSC, Cinder client, and then in the future, when we switch things, it will get from Cinder client. Okay.
And that's been kind of my concern, because right now, as developers, we want to add a feature, and we've already understood that, okay, fine, if it's an API thing, then we've got to, make some code changes in Cinder itself, and then make some code changes in Cinder client, and hey, we're done. Well, now it's like, well, no, actually, there's 2 other repositories you're going to have to go and update as well. That to me is aggravating, but this seems to be what the rest of the OpenStack community wants to do.
So is the idea eventually is to migrate all of the clients to the SDK, if all things being equal? The SDK is the source for adding features, and then the client...
I believe that's their end goal.
Okay.
Now,
which, again, sounds good. It's just that, again, now you got to go make changes in so many repositories. It's a little more annoying.
At some point, though, the SDK was described as an opinionated thing. So it's supposed to support the most common cases in a friendly way, but it's not. My understanding was, and this may have changed, was that it was not a drop-in replacement for any of the clients. There's also, it gets very sloppy when you read the proposals up there between, right, the CLI client and just our client classes that people can use programmatically in Python to interact with Cinder. So that's the other thing, is that it's not really obvious to me. Well, anyway, I'll just throw it out. So it's not clear to me exactly what the end goal is and how these parts fit together, because it makes a big difference for us in trying to do planning. Because if the OSC does use Cinder client, then as long as our client classes expose everything Cinder, everything you can do communicating with the API, then it's just a user interface problem, and we don't have to worry about it. But then the SDK there was talk at one point that the OSC would only communicate with the SDK, but I guess that's not the case anymore. Do we know?
That's the idea. Yes.
It will not, or it will.
It will. The idea is
will.
to replace. SDK will be the only. It will be just client and SDK together.
Right. So, but if the SDK is an opinionated, approach to the API, then we still need a Cinder client.
Depends on what opinionated means.
Well, historically, look at the state of the world right now. The OpenStack client is also an opinionated UI for end users to talk to the services, and they've tried their best to use the same kind of terminologies for similar underlying technologies that each of the services provide. And a lot of the times there isn't any corresponding mutual term to use for some services, very specific things. And so how do you expose that in a generic, friendly way? And that's really one of the factors of why we initially just kind of like did hands off for the OpenStack client years ago, is because they wanted to drive Cinder itself and how to interact with Cinder, when we're like, well, we have all this stuff we want to do, and that's not the way we want to expose ourselves. So we're going to have that same issue, especially with the SDK, which, I mean, I like the idea of an SDK. You go to one place and you can call any service that you want. That's fantastic from a developer standpoint. But from a Cinder developer standpoint, how do we make sure that all of our stuff and all of our feature sets with all of our microversions and up until recently our API versions that we had, all of that's going to work?
Yeah, because the big problem I keep seeing is that people prefer. I like using curl for everything, but nobody else does. So people like having some type of command line client to do operator type stuff. And if that's not going to be included in the SDK and hence not in the OSC, then we still need to provide some kind of CLI to go with the Cinder client.
Yes, and my rudimentary understanding based upon this conversation is that if the Cinder client used the SDK for its interactions with Cinder, but the Cinder client's job was only to just expose that up to the user, it theoretically could expose the same API that we have today, and just we replace the back end with the SDK versus our current tree of classes that expose as a Cinder client. We can shim that theoretically, but that's a monumental task.
Yeah.
But at some point, this is going to come to a head if they're going to say, hey, OpenStack client, we're no longer going to consume the Cinder client because you're not part of the SDK, then what do we do at that point? I mean, that's an OpenStack problem at that point.
Well, I think right now the OpenStack client does not consume Cinder client. Is that correct, Alan? I think it's got its own
Say
stuff.
it again, please.
The OpenStack client does not consume Cinder client to do its stuff.
It does.
It does. Oh.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it has a shim in there that, depending upon the versions that are available, instantiates the correct Cinder version.
Exactly.
Cinder version, sorry.
Yep.
So then it sounds like there's really nothing for us to do.
But they don't want to consume the Cinder client. They want to consume SDK.
And there are also other reasons for use the SDK, because SDK is used also by other projects, like, for example, Ansible. So all the support that you have in Ansible for volumes comes from OpenStack SDK. So there is a good reason in itself and that I suspect that's not going away. So that's a good reason in itself to have the support there at some point, of course, in the long term. And by the way, I added to the Etherpad a link to some of the open stories in Storyboard about the missing support of APIs in SDK, and some of them have been addressed recently by those students. So that's at least a good news.
So then, if
this sounds like a discussion that needs to be raised up to the TC and find out what the overall plan is, and if there is a drop dead date that they're trying to force upon the OSC to use the SDK at some point, because we need to know that way in advance.
Well, they won't come up with a date, but they've come up with a statement that the OSC is the preferred way to do everything, and that if you can't use it, you're supposed to file bugs. Okay.
So we end up with a bunch of bugs against OSC that can't do Cinder XYZ API, and everybody ignores it, and we move on.
Yeah. Yeah, so Okay.
I mean, I don't think we're going to solve this here, but it seems like this is a planning problem and a resource problem.
Right. It's an optimization problem, and I think the initial effort was done back in those days where people were just throwing money at OpenStack, and so if you had a redundant UI team, it didn't matter, and we're left with some infrastructure that doesn't quite accomplish what we want. So I guess the main thing is if the SDK is going to implement, right, if it's going to provide Python language bindings for the block storage API, then that's good. We would no longer need the Cinder client. But if it's only going to implement opinionated bindings, then we're back where we started from. So I guess that's
whatever opinionated they may be, if they want to implement all the things we have already in the current client right now, they will need to expose the same functionalities. So in the end, it will have to expose everything. So I don't see that a problem, just to summarize my point. It will have to expose whatever is needed to expose the functionalities and not regress anything in the support. So it's just a matter of who is going to do the work.
Right.
That's the problem.
Yeah, I think that's Walter said.
Yeah.
Resource and planning.
So it leaves right. No, it's just in terms of what do we do in Xena, it's like shit, this is absolutely no help at all.
Well, I think
we removed V2 support.
Yeah, but being realistic, I think it makes sense just to do OSC and Cinder client, because the number of people that are going to use the SDK for Cinder features programmatically, we can ignore them for now. If they are doing programmatically, they're probably using the Cinder client directly. And what we want is to gain or not to get bugs from people that are using OpenStack client. We want to get
as long as the OpenStack client is using Cinder client now, then it should be relatively easy to put up this extra patch for the OSC. So I'm okay with that. I just don't want us putting a lot of time into this and then have it all ripped out because the SDK is, well, anyway, we're not going to worry about that. We'll take Luigi's point that if they're going to replace the current Cinder client usage with SDK, the SDK will have to be feature complete before they can do that. So that's cool. Okay. All right. Actually, I don't know why I feel better because nothing has changed. Okay.
Well, yeah, it has changed. We have decided that every single microversion needs to have OSC, which means that we are not going to keep increasing the gap, which is a big step forward. And Alan said that he's going to try to close the gap as well by adding older microversions. So progress.
Yeah, absolutely. It's better than what we have now.
As I like to say, hope springs eternal.
All right. So Alan, if you can get just, I'm going to call it the Alan API, right? So Alan has his own microversion 3.64 that exposes the encryption key ID. So if you get that into OSC, that'll be good, because I think a lot of our microversion changes are things like that, where it's just extra elements being added to the response. And they should be able to handle the response, so it's just a matter of getting the microversion across, maybe.
Yes. In fact, what I'm hoping to start next week, my own work is a survey of our microversions and see if I can pick off a bunch of these low-hanging fruit. So 364 is a perfect example of one of those, and I'm hoping that the quick survey will identify several more.
Good. All right, cool.
I'll include the one that you list here, Walt, 334.
So I had so maybe I'm misunderstanding the resource. So okay. So are we finished with the OpenStack client discussion? Do I need to put like a? I probably do, or I'm gonna forget. But basically, I think we got a good understanding. This thing about the resource filters with the tilde, I thought what the resource filters did was say which things you could filter on, and the tilde was just those get included if you do the microversion, but you wouldn't specify them in the resource filter JSON.
I think if you wanted to do a generic filter on any portion of a name field, you had to do the name tilde. It's not just the entire name, it's a portion of the name, if I understand correctly. And just by having name in there means you have to match the entire thing, not a portion of it.
Right, but I thought the microversion allowed you to attach the tilde to any of the resource filters that are in resourcefilter.json. But it may
That
be
could be the case. What I actually saw happening was in our resource filters is we only had name tilde. We had others as well, but
right.
Talking specifically about the name. Unless we added name back in without the tilde, we couldn't do any filtering on name at all.
Right.
The portions was not even matching at all.
Right, and that makes sense because that whole name and name tilde would be disallowed if you don't include name.
Yes.
In resource
yes.
filter. But you were finding
that deprecated code was removed, then all of a sudden we couldn't do any filtering on name at all at that point.
Okay.
So that kind of raised the question of, since OpenStack client doesn't support microversions, is it safe for us as a project to remove deprecated API code? I mean, obviously we want to help us deal with support issues and cruft that we have in our code, so I understand that aspect of it. But from our customer's standpoint, we got an upgraded version of Cinder that now doesn't support the stuff that used to support. So
okay.
I see it from both sides. But I fixed it with a hack, I suppose, but I'm not sure what to do about this in the future. Maybe there's another deprecated thing. I don't know if we do or not that we're planning on removing, but it could have been something more difficult that it couldn't have fixed as easily. I guess that's what I'm saying.
But this is something that I believe will happen eventually, because the idea of microversion is that at some point we can drop support for everything below a certain microversion, and just say anything below 350 is no longer supported, and that will be, like you say, will bring a lot of trouble potentially, because we will be disabling a lot of things.
Yes, it will break a lot of stuff. And during the initial discussion with the Nova team about microversions at all, if you remember, one of the things that the Nova team was basically saying, well, once we set that minimum version, we can never increase it, basically, because there's always going to be someone who's using that feature, super awesome 3.1 feature that we're going to get rid of because we want to upgrade everybody to 3.5, then their cloud is broken now. So from a customer standpoint and a deployer standpoint, that's like, well, we can't do that. So then, what do we do as a Cinder team? And we're left with a bunch of cruft in our code that we have to support forever.
Well, until we draw version 3 in 3023.
Yeah. Yep. So I guess when we do reviews for removing deprecated code, we just have to be aware of this and determine if we want to allow that, depending upon what we're removing from what's been deprecated and for how long. I mean, the feature that was removed and trained had been deprecated for quite a long time, but removing deprecated code has just its own issues in general.
But I think the problem with that patch that removed it, from my perspective, is that we were logging it in the Cinder logs but we were not letting the user of Cinder client know anything. So when we deprecate this and we start thinking of removing something, we have to add to the Cinder client the warning. This will be deprecated, because letting the operator know in the huge log file is useless.
Yeah.
They are not going to go to the 1,000 users and let them know, hey, this is no longer going to be supported. That's crazy. So I think part of your idea of being more careful could be adding to the Cinder client a user message to let them know, hey, this is working, but this will be removed.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Because in our deployment, we have all of the logs going into Kibana, and we're looking for errors. We're looking for fatal issues, and everything else we don't give a shit about. We never even see it, and we get so many alerts about so many problems. We don't care about even some of the fatal ones that come up because there's just so much. And so this is such a small issue until it all of a sudden is a big issue. And that's how the visibility is raised. And I guess from a Cinder Core's perspective, I have to be educated about this and be more careful in what we allow to be removed. And that has its own set of issues. It's a philosophical issue more than anything, and how much cruft and debt do we leave around, and for how long? And unfortunately, the lag in which deployers, myself being one as well, deploys versions of OpenStack and Cinder also compounds issues as well, too, because we like our cloud to run, and upgrading is very scary.
And your concern with removing deprecated code reminds me of one that I've been looking at, and I think it's problematic, which is the multi-attach parameter that create volume can receive, because it overrides what the operator has set in their cloud currently. So the operator creates a volume type. It says it's multi-attach. Then it says, or it doesn't put that it's multi-attach because they know that it cannot be, they don't want to enable it.
Right.
But the user can make the create request and say, I want it to be multi-attach, even if the volume type does not allow me to do it. And that is something that in the code we say, yeah, we want to deprecate this. But now we come to a point where can we deprecate it without breaking somebody's code? Way of working, because they may decide that they don't create volume types specifying the multi-attach, and they just make the color specified.
Yep.
So how do we remove this?
That's a really good question.
We can add a microversion that disable it, but then again, it's back to the user to decide whether to use it or not.
Right. Yeah. Yep.
So besides a configuration option that says disable this, and then we return a proper user message saying this feature has been disabled in Cinder, I cannot think of any other way to remove that piece of the code.
I don't either, especially if you're going to use the microversion as a way to determine whether it's enabled or not. And adding a new feature makes sense, but removing a feature and bumping the microversion, if you don't use that microversion, I would assume that the feature exists.
Exactly. So it would be it's better a configuration option, and just let the administrator of Cinder define whether they want their users to have it available or not.
Yeah.
And then if they disable it and they get complaints, they can either enable it or ignore customers.
Yeah.
Or users.
Which customers love.
I think we're got to move on to the next topic. But this is good. We've resolved a few things. Okay.
I think.
Next up, let's see. Lance is here. We're going to discuss the secure RBAC thing. I'm going to stop the recording and restart, so this is in its own segment, because it'll make it easier to find. So I'm going to stop recording now.